All right, so we just bolted from Baker Street like our arses were on fire, which, considering the circumstances, they practically were. Holmes, in his infinite wisdom, decided our best bet wasn't to go to the official constabulary because, they're mostly useful for tripping over their own feet, but to go underground, literally. Turns out, London has more than just sewers beneath its cobbled streets. It's got an entire goddamn kingdom. And let me tell you, it smelled like desperation and stale pipe tobacco. Chapter 2, The Kingdom Below. London's underworld, I discovered, was not a metaphor. Holmes led me through a series of increasingly disreputable neighborhoods until we reached what appeared to be a derelict warehouse in Bermondsey. The building looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and its walls covered with the kind of grime that only decades of neglect could produce. Charming location, I observed as Holmes approached what appeared to be a solid brick wall. "Appearances can be deceiving," he replied, pressing his hand against a particular brick. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. The passage led to a world I had never imagined existed beneath London streets. It was a vast network of tunnels, chambers, and underground spaces that had been carved out over centuries by smugglers, criminals, and others who preferred to conduct their business away from official scrutiny. The tunnels were not empty. As we descended, I could hear voices, see the flicker of lanterns, and smell the distinctive mix of humanity, tobacco, and less identifiable substances that suggested active habitation. "Welcome to the kingdom below," Holmes said as we entered a large chamber lit by oil lamps and heated by braziers. Home to those who find the world above insufficiently hospitable. The chamber was populated by perhaps 24 individuals, all of whom looked up as we entered. They were a diverse group, men and women, young and old, well-dressed and ragged, but they shared a common wariness that suggested they were all refugees from something. "Sherlock," called out a woman with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "What brings you to our humble kingdom?" "Circumstances beyond my control, Mother Blackwood," Holmes replied. "I need sanctuary for myself and my associate." Mother Blackwood, apparently no relation to Arthur, looked me up and down with calculating eyes. "And what can your associate contribute to our little community?" "He's an accountant," Holmes said, "with specialized knowledge of financial irregularities." Several people in the chamber laughed. "An honest accountant," said one. "That's a rare commodity down here." Mother Blackwood smiled. "Indeed it is. Welcome, Mr. Charles," I said, deciding to stick with my real name for simplicity. "Charles it is. Find yourselves a corner and try not to get in anyone's way." The kingdom below, as I discovered over the following days, was a remarkable society. It operated according to its own laws and customs, provided its own security and justice, and maintained a complex economy based on barter, favors, and information. The inhabitants included professional criminals, political refugees, people fleeing abusive relationships, individuals who had simply fallen through the cracks of legitimate society, and those who, for various reasons, preferred to live outside the reach of official authority. Holmes, I learned, was a valued member of this underground community. He provided services, investigation, mediation, problem solving, in exchange for information, sanctuary, and access to resources that weren't available through conventional channels. "You've been living a double life," I observed as we settled into a corner of the chamber that had been designated as our temporary quarters. "Triple, actually," Holmes replied. "The consulting detective is just one of my personas. The work I do down here is equally important and considerably more dangerous." "What kind of work?" "The kind that official law enforcement can't or won't handle. Missing persons who don't officially exist. Crimes that involve people too powerful to prosecute through conventional means. Justice for those who wouldn't get it any other way." It was a fascinating glimpse into a parallel world that existed literally beneath the feet of respectable London society. But it was also a reminder that our situation was more precarious than ever. We were now fugitives, cut off from conventional resources and support. "What's our next move?" I asked. "We gather intelligence," Holmes said. "We use the resources down here to learn everything we can about Blackwood's operation, and then we plan our attack." Attack. Charles, conventional law enforcement has failed. Blackwood has corrupted enough officials to protect himself from prosecution. If we want justice, we'll have to take it ourselves. It was a sobering realization. We had moved beyond investigation into what could only be described as vigilante action. The accountant in me recoiled from the idea of operating outside legal channels, but the realist in me recognized that legal channels had been compromised. The resources available in the kingdom below were unlike anything I could have imagined. Within hours of our arrival, Holmes had put out word about our investigation, and information began flowing in from sources throughout London's criminal underworld. A pickpocket had observed unusual activity at one of Blackwood's warehouses. A forger had been approached about creating false documentation for a large shipment. A prostitute had overheard conversations between well-dressed men about the India problem and the need for permanent solutions. Piece by piece, we began to assemble a picture of what Blackwood was planning. "It's bigger than money laundering," Holmes said as we studied the information we'd gathered. "They're planning something that requires massive funding, complete secrecy, and the elimination of anyone who might interfere. Such as us. Among others, yes." The picture that emerged was of a conspiracy that went far beyond criminal enterprise into the realm of political subversion. Blackwood's network wasn't just cleaning money for criminals. They were financing activities that could destabilize entire regions of the empire. The India connection was particularly troubling. Large sums were being moved to fund what appeared to be intelligence operations in the subcontinent, but the purpose wasn't clear. Were they gathering information for the British government or for someone else? And why the need for such extreme secrecy? "We need more information," Holmes said. "Specifically, we need to know what's in that warehouse Wickham mentioned, the one where the big shipment was supposed to arrive. How do you propose we get that information?" Holmes smiled, and I was beginning to recognize that particular expression as a warning that he was about to suggest something dangerous. "We're going to break in." The warehouse in question was located in Wapping, near the London docks. It was owned by a shipping company that was officially separate from Meridian Trading, but shared several directors and financial connections that suggested common ownership. Holmes had obtained detailed plans of the building through his underground contacts, along with information about the security arrangements and guard schedules. The plan he devised was audacious in its simplicity. "We wait until the late shift change," he explained. "There's a 15-minute window when the guard positions overlap, creating a blind spot at the north entrance. We go in, gather what information we can, and leave before the next patrol. And if we're caught, then we improvise." It wasn't the most reassuring answer, but I was beginning to understand that certainty was a luxury we couldn't afford. We made our approach on a foggy November night, moving through the maze of warehouses and loading docks that lined the Thames. The area was busy even at night, with ships being loaded and unloaded, cargo being moved, and workers going about their business with a focused efficiency of people who were paid to ignore whatever they might see. The warehouse itself was a massive brick structure with few windows and multiple entrances. Holmes led us to the north side, where a narrow alley provided cover for our approach. "There," he whispered, pointing to a door that was barely visible in the fog. "That leads to the administrative offices. If there are records, that's where they'll be." The lock was more sophisticated than I'd expected, but Holmes proved to have skills that weren't typically associated with consulting detection. He had the door open in less than 2 minutes. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit by a few gas lamps, creating pools of light separated by areas of deep shadow. The main floor was filled with stacks of crates and barrels, all neatly labeled and organized according to some system that wasn't immediately apparent. "This way," Holmes whispered, leading me toward a flight of stairs that led to the office level. The offices were dark, but Holmes had brought a small lantern that provided enough light to examine the contents of desks and filing cabinets. Most of the paperwork was routine shipping documents, but Holmes found what he was looking for in a locked drawer of the manager's desk. "Manifests," he said, spreading several documents on the desk. "Look at this." The manifests detailed shipments from India that had arrived over the past several months. The cargo was listed as archaeological specimens and historical artifacts, but the weights and dimensions suggested something much more substantial than ancient pottery. "Archaeological specimens that weigh several tons each," I observed. "What do you think they really are?" "I have a suspicion," Holmes said, continuing to examine the documents. "But I prefer to see the actual cargo before drawing conclusions." We made our way back to the main floor of the warehouse, moving carefully between the stacks of cargo toward the area where the manifests indicated the Indian shipments were stored. What we found was not what either of us had expected. The crates were enormous, each one the size of a small room, and they were clearly too heavy to be moved by conventional means. They had been positioned near a specially constructed loading dock that was equipped with heavy machinery for handling oversized cargo. But it wasn't the size of the crates that was most disturbing. It was what was painted on their sides. Each crate bore symbols that I recognized from my reading about Indian culture and religion. They were Sanskrit characters, painted in what appeared to be gold, and they suggested that the contents were not archaeological specimens, but something that had religious or ceremonial significance. "This is not smuggling," Holmes said quietly. "This is theft on a massive scale. They're looting temples and sacred sites." "For what purpose?" "Profit, certainly. But also," Holmes trailed off, studying the symbols more carefully. "Charles, these markings, they're not just identifying the contents. They're warnings." "Warnings about what?" Before Holmes could answer, we heard the sound of footsteps on the warehouse floor. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the purposeful stride of people who knew exactly where they were going. "Hide," Holmes whispered, extinguishing his lantern. We took cover behind a stack of smaller crates, just as the main warehouse lights came on. In the sudden brightness, I could see half a dozen men entering through the main door, all of them armed and moving with military precision. "Check the offices," one of them called out. "If anyone's been here, there'll be signs." My heart sank. We had been careful, but not careful enough. Holmes had left the locked drawer open, and the manifests were still spread on the desk. "They know we're here," I whispered. "Not necessarily," Holmes replied, "but they will soon." The search was methodical and thorough. The men spread out through the warehouse, checking behind every stack of cargo, in every shadow, around every piece of equipment. It was only a matter of time before they found us. That's when I saw the cat. It was perched impossibly on top of one of the massive crates from India, its tiny top hat perfectly straight despite the precarious position. As I watched, it began to walk along the edge of the crate, its claws making tiny scratching sounds against the wood. The sounds were barely audible, but in the tense silence of the warehouse, they seemed unnaturally loud. One of the searchers looked up, trying to locate the source of the noise. "What was that?" he called out. "Probably rats," another replied. "This place is full of them." But the first man was suspicious. He began moving toward the area where the cat had been, his weapon drawn and ready. The cat, meanwhile, had jumped to another crate, this one closer to the main door. Again, its claws scraped against the wood, creating a sound that drew the attention of the searchers. One by one, The men began moving toward the front of the warehouse, following the sounds. It was as if the cat was deliberately leading them away from our hiding place. "Now," Holmes whispered, while they're distracted. We moved quickly but carefully toward the north entrance, staying in the shadows and making as little noise as possible. Behind us, I could hear the searchers calling to each other, their voices growing more distant as they followed the mysterious sounds toward the front of the warehouse. We reached the door just as one of the men shouted, "There, I saw something." Holmes had the door open in seconds, and we slipped out into the fog-shrouded alley. As we hurried away from the warehouse, I looked back to see a small, dark shape drop silently from the roof and disappear into the night. "Did you see that?" I asked as we put distance between ourselves and the warehouse. "See what?" "The cat. It was leading them away from us." Holmes was quiet for a moment. "Charles, I've told you before. It saved our lives, Holmes. Whatever that thing is, it's not just a hallucination. Even if you're correct, we have more pressing concerns. What we saw in that warehouse changes everything." He was right. The evidence we'd gathered suggested that Blackwood's network was involved in systematic looting of Indian temples and sacred sites. The artifacts were being smuggled to London and then presumably sold to private collectors who didn't ask questions about provenance. But the scale of the operation suggested something more than simple art theft. The massive crates, the specialized equipment, the heavy security, it all pointed to something that went beyond commerce into the realm of cultural destruction. "They're not just stealing artifacts," I said as we made our way back toward the kingdom below. "They're destroying an entire civilization's heritage and making enormous profits doing it," Holmes added. "But there's something else. Those Sanskrit markings weren't just decorative. They were specific warnings about the contents of the crates." "What kind of warnings?" "The kind that suggest the contents are dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with monetary value." We spent the rest of the night in the kingdom below, sharing what we'd learned with Mother Blackwood and the other inhabitants. The reaction was immediate and intense. "Temple robbery," said an elderly man who introduced himself as Professor Singh. "In my country, this would be considered not just theft, but sacrilege of the highest order." Professor Singh, it turned out, was a scholar of Indian history and religion who had fled to London after becoming involved in anti-colonial activities. His knowledge of Sanskrit and temple customs provided crucial context for what we discovered. "The markings you describe," he said, studying Holmes's careful notes, "they're not just warnings. They're curses, specific protections that are placed on sacred objects to prevent their removal from holy sites." "You're talking about supernatural protection," I said. "Surely you don't believe." "What I believe is irrelevant," Professor Singh interrupted. "What matters is that whoever placed those markings believed in their power. And more importantly, whoever removed the objects despite those markings has committed acts that will have consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Professor Singh looked troubled. "In my culture, we believe that such actions create imbalances that must eventually be corrected. The question is not whether there will be consequences, but what form they will take." "You're talking about supernatural retribution," Holmes said. "Surely." "I'm talking about forces that your Western science doesn't recognize," Professor Singh interrupted. "That doesn't make them less real." Mother Blackwood had been listening to the conversation with interest. "Whether you believe in curses or not," she said, "the fact remains that Blackwood's operation is causing real harm to real people. And that's something we can do something about." "What do you suggest?" "Direct action. We know where his warehouses are. We know how his operation works. We have people who can get into places where conventional law enforcement can't go." "You're talking about breaking the law." "We're talking about justice," Mother Blackwood corrected. "The law has failed. Blackwood has corrupted enough officials to protect himself from prosecution. If we want to stop him, we'll have to do it ourselves." It was a sobering moment. We had reached the point where conventional approaches had been exhausted. If we wanted to stop Blackwood's operation, we would have to resort to methods that were themselves illegal. What kind of direct action? Holmes asked. Sabotage, Mother Blackwood said simply. We destroy his warehouses, interrupt his shipments, make his operation too expensive and too dangerous to continue. And if we're caught, then we disappear. That's always been the risk of living in the kingdom below. The conversation continued late into the night, with various members of the community contributing ideas and resources. By morning, we had the outline of a plan that was audacious, dangerous, and quite possibly suicidal. But it was also our only remaining option. Are you ready for this? Holmes asked as we finalized the details. I thought about the accountant I'd been just a few months earlier, the man who had lived a quiet, predictable life and thought he understood how the world worked. That person seemed like a stranger now. I'm ready, I said. And I meant it. So that's how we ended up knowing about Blackwood's little cultural appropriation hobby and his even bigger political bullshit, temple looting, espionage, and all sorts of other high-minded villainy. And we were stuck in a hole in the ground, planning to break into a warehouse like a couple of common criminals. Irony, isn't it? Holmes, naturally, was practically orgasmic at the prospect. Me? I was just hoping I wouldn't get impaled by sacred relic or shot by some colonial arsehole. We're going in. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Remember to like and subscribe for more of my stories. If you have suggestions of stories I should tell that are in the public domain, leave a comment below, or don't. I don't care.